Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog Solo, and we continue our long discussion of the history of the term imperialism. In the last episode, I went into a deep dive into Finance Capital by Rudolf Hilferding. In this episode, I'm going to pick another luminary of the Second International, and one to which both Bukharin and Lenin were responding to. If you see our first episode on imperialism in this series, you can hear me talk a little bit about that. We're going to go into a lot more about that today. And who we're talking about, because I need to mention that, we are talking about Karl Kautsky, the Pope of the Second International. Now, we are really referring to a brief work by Kautsky that we will hear referred to as super-imperialism, and it's a mistitling. The mistitling itself is somewhat interesting. The expression super-imperialism actually is a mistranslation that appeared almost as soon as the actual essay did itself. When the essay was rerun by William E. Varn of the International Socialist Review, and don't be confused, there's been several International Socialist Reviews. I'm not talking about the one ran by the Cliffite Trotskyist organization that only went out in the middle teens. I'm talking about the one that ran from 1900 to 1918, published by Charles H. Kerr and Co., which was also a Marxist theoretical journal, often republishing English translations of things from the Second International. And in fact, until our friends over at Marxism Translated started picking this back up, a lot of the translations that we had of these key Second International texts in German actually are from this magazine periodical in this time period. But anyway, Baum believed that the terms cartel and ultra-imperialism were not reasonable for the audience of International Socialist Review because cartels had a slightly different, more criminal implication in the United States than it did in Europe. And ultra meant exaggerated or extreme at the time, not, like Ubermensch or ultra-imperialism, which just means more intense, an intensification in German. So opting to translate ultra-imperialismus as super-imperialism, which stuck in English, and that's what I knew this text by, for a long time. However, if you go look on the Marxist Internet Archive, the new translations do tend to translate this as ultra-imperialism. Now, the concepts in this piece we'll get to in a minute, but it talks about cartelization from the banks to the state itself. And you can see a development here from Finance Capital by Hilferding into what Kautsky is really talking about with the states forming cartel-like organizations, both formal and informal. He wasn't the first person to predict this. John A. Hobson of imperialism fame. Hobson was a left liberal who thought imperialism was not capitalism and is often cited extensively by Lenin and other people, as I mentioned before. But Hobson's really what changed the definition of imperialism. Prior to Hobson, imperialism was explicitly tied to the imperial executive more than to neocolonialism or any of that. In 1907, Karl Liebknecht stated in his brochure, Militarism and Anti-Militarism, quote, a trustification of all actual and potential colonies among the colonial powers, so to speak, a disabling of colonial rivalries among states could take place in the future as it occurred to some extent for private competition between capitalist entrepreneurs and cartels and trust. So there was this general feeling, both amongst the left liberals and amongst the socialists, that we could see the states doing the same thing that we'd seen different businesses doing to establish monopoly power to forego the threat of war. Now, Kautsky's writing this ultra-imperialism work around the same time as he's trying to justify his milquetoast response to the beginnings of World War I. Kautsky tried to justify the German response, but he ultimately voted against it. And when he needed to break with the SPD, he did, becoming part of the independent social Democrats, or the USPD. But all that aside, he still felt the need to kind of take a moderate tack on the war. There have been many speculations as this is tied into this, including by Lenin. This was published in September of 1914 in Die Neue Zeit, although we see rumblings of this in some of Kautsky's writing as early as 1912, not 1812, 1912. So he had been thinking about this and the beginnings of Imperial Germany for quite a while. Now, we'll talk about Lenin's response to this, but Lenin's response to this also comes before his famous 1917 text, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. In fact, the first time we see this mentioned is Lenin's introduction to Nikolai Bukharin's Imperialism, the World Economy, written in 1916, which Lenin introduces with mentions to Kautsky's mistakes as he saw it. In fact, he said, quote, in one abstract, and the abstract one can think of as such a place, in practice, he who denies the sharp task of today in the name of dreams about soft tasks of the future becomes an opportunist. So he's talking about the fact that, yes, there could be an ultra-imperialism that develops, but we're not seeing it in 1914 or 1917 and, into the weighty days of World War I. Now, I think this is important because I've actually pointed out that a lot of the 20th century, actually by and large an effect of the Cold War and the post-World War II consensus, really did seem to operate more like the ultra-imperialism described by Kautsky than the imperialism described by Lenin. And it's not that there wasn't imperialism, it's just, or even, neocolonial holdings, any of that. It was more that it was sublimated into these mass organizations and semi-cartel states like the IMF and the UN that made it play by certain rules so that the big powers didn't confront each other, at least not directly. Now, it's hard to foresee that it's a pretty big deal for Kautsky to miss that only happens in the light of there being an actual or at least nominal socialist power on the planet. So it's hard to say that's a vindication of Kautsky's view, but it does actually seem like the conditions Kautsky was describing did come about. Now, that gets us to what were the conditions Kautsky was describing. One, Kautsky more or less agreed that capitalist states were super exploiting labor in agrarian regions, particularly colonial agrarian regions, but in agrarian regions in general, which, post world system theory might call the periphery, both within the core and outside of it, in order to increase imperialist nations' productivity on the market. And this also encouraged capitalist states to introduce protectionist measures and defend their empires militarily to maintain this way to get this super exploiting labor in their peripheries, meaning that trade leverage and arbitrage wasn't going to be the only thing going on. And he did believe this was the ultimate cause of World War I. Now, one of the things that he had talked about is that industrial accumulation had continued, but exports had dropped as a result of the tendency of industry to expand out of proportion to agriculture. That in most developed capitalist economies, you see that the industrial productive sector outstrips the agricultural productive sector, although it's not true in places like the United States, where the reverse today is true. We export more than we import in terms of food versus versus manufacturing. And we can make of how we compare this to the classical periods in which imperialism is theorized, both by Lenin and Super-Imperialism by Kautsky, but nonetheless. He thought that that nationalism was going to hit the more industrial advanced colonies, and this would necessitate a continuation of the arms race after the war. But if the arms race continued, the economic stagnation would worsen. And he thought that the only way the capitalists could get out of this was to maintain some sort of cartel system in the same manner in which the banks had operated and cooperated as a kind of cartel, to limit their competition and renounce their arms race in order to maintain their export markets and their systems of super exploitation without the military eating up all of the profits. And thus he postulated that war and militarism were not essential features of capitalism, and that peaceful capitalism was possible, but not likely. So he agrees with a lot of conditions that both Hobson before him and Lenin after him and Bukharin indeed as well see, and he bases his views off of a combination of Hilferding and Liebknecht, that Hilferding is right about finance capital, and that Liebknecht had seen even before that there was already cartelization amongst the banks and that nations may follow suit. But what to be done with that is not clear. Now, let's talk about the specifics of features of ultra-imperialism or super-imperialism, according to Kautsky. 1, joint exploitation. He actually thought that strong nations would stop competing via arms races and instead unite to manage the underdeveloped world collectively. And I mean, whether you think the UN was for, but anyway, that hadn't existed yet, so it's hard to say that that was just him basing stuff off of stuff that did not happen until the end of World War One. The League of Nations was an attempt at this and failed. It was the United Nations that really set all this up, and that was set up under the constraints of the Cold War, and that needs to be acknowledged. Kautsky believed that the immense costs of modern warfare and the disruption of trade would eventually force the hand of the bourgeoisie to seek peace, at least among each other, in order to manage the periphery for all the core capitalist nations' benefits. Now, this falling from Hilferding led him to think that this was actually probably a good thing, not just for the reasons of peace, but that the anarchy of international competition would be replaced by managed, organized global economy, and that democratic revolutions in the capitalist world could then seize power of this managed economy and turn this to an international. And this is where I think Kautsky jumps the shark, personally. While I have said that I think a lot of the 20th century after the development of the Soviet Union does somewhat resemble Kautsky's super-imperialism, and that you have cartels of states really managing the developing world. It takes the Soviet Union to scare them enough to do it. Now, if I was just to do a brief bullet point summary about the differences between Kautsky and Lenin, for Kautsky, war is an expensive mistake that capitalists could eventually outgrow, even though it was the natural logic of their colonial holdings. So again, Kautsky and Lenin agree more than they initially seem about the conditions on the ground in the 19 teens. 2, this could lead to a period of capitalist stability, according to Kautsky. Lenin saw this as inherently unstable, and this leads to national liberation revolutions and other things in response to imperialism. 3, Kautsky thought the states could cooperate members of a business cartel, thus ensuring their mutual survival, where Lenin thought that they were instruments of national capital, that being states, and that they must clash. It is interesting, though, the WTO, the IMF, NATO, CETO, really does kind of look like what Kautsky was describing. We would not describe them as cartels per se, but don't they really exist to manage the Cold War and also to make sure that the uppity parts of the developing world don't get too uppity? Feels like that's why they were maintained even after the fall of the Soviet Union. So, Kautsky basically proposes there's a rational exit strategy for capitalism, that the cartelization of the banks creates an ability for the socialists to seize that by democratic means and thus manage the economy. Um, and he's agreeing with Hilferding on this. And two, it creates a rational exit strategy for global capitalism because the establishment of these international cooperation cartels would themselves be the basis of socialist cooperation if socialist governments were to win the democratic revolution, so to speak. Now, admittedly, ultra-imperialism doesn't go into all this in detail because it's a short text. It is like Lenin's imperialism, really more of a pamphlet. When we talk about books, we're really talking about Hobson and Bukharin in this period, and Hobson's not even a Marxist. Now, there's some other critiques Lenin proffered. One, and this is in his work on imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. He says that Kautsky's theory supposed that the rule of finance capital lessens the unevenness and contradictions inherent in the world economy, whereas in reality it increases them. All right, so the monopolies established by banks actually increase the anarchy in the world economy because they require strong national governments to support the banks, and the cartelization does not really work in the same way on the international scale. Another thing that Lenin asserts about Kautsky's theory is what means other than war could be under capitalism to overcome the disparity between the development of productive forces and the accumulation of capital on one side and the division of the colonies and spheres of influence for finance capital on the other. And in the lead up to World War I, and even in the lead up to World War II, Lenin seems very much correct. And also, Lenin seems probably correct now, but the late half of the 20th century, it's a little bit different. Um, I'm not the first person to point out that the cooperation between capitalist states during the Cold War resembled this ultra-imperialism. That Martin Thomas of the Trotskyist Workers' Liberty himself pointed out that since the collapse of the Marxist-Leninists, he said Stalinist bloc in 89-91, that ultra-imperialism has extended to cover almost the whole globe, and even citing that China was increasingly cooperating with the capitalist world. Um, Although many people have also pointed out in response to this that while ultra imperialism may have seemed to exist during the Cold War as a kind of detente between the capitalists to take on possible socialist forces, that the Cold War's end would return inter-capitalist competition and the likelihood of more direct forms of imperialism instead of indirect forms of materialism between capitalist states competing with each other, which would likely lead to war. Now, nuclear war armaments do change the logic here a little bit about direct versus indirect war. But if you looked at the number of proxy wars breaking out right now, you might think that the second grouping here has a point. So, if we look at Lenin's critique of Kautsky, that we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to Lenin. I mean, I'm struggling if I'm going to do a whole episode just on Lenin's imperialism because I've talked about it before, and also because it comes up in all these early episodes. There's no way to avoid it. Um, but I do want to get into some of the ways we can look at this conflict. One, Lenin thinks that cartelization would at best be a temporary solution because one nation will grow stronger while the others have weakened, even in a cartel situation. See the United States. The stronger nation will no longer be satisfied with its old share. See Donald Trump. And since there's no more unclaimed land, the only way to redivide the world is through force. See all the talk about Greenland. Therefore, any peace is just a truce between the wars, which they can be rather long truces, though, and that's something that the Kautskyites might say to Lenin. But Lenin seems to be backed up as fundamental logic when we look at today. Now, we have to talk about other elements of this, whether or not accumulation or removal of excess capacity is what's driving imperialism, and there is a big difference in those theories. And believe it or not, the accumulation theory goes back to Marx, although again, remember, he wouldn't have called it imperialism because imperialism means something else in his day. He called it the so-called primitive accumulation law. Two, that imperialism is a policy that governments could decide to change through establishing cartels to limit their competition, and he bakes this off of the ideas that he saw in banking. But in Lenin's view, imperialism is structurally necessary. Banking and industry had merged into finance capital anyway, so the difference between banks and industry was barely there. And they reached a point where they had to export capital to maintain profits. It wasn't a choice that they could vote away, nor could they cartelize and still maintain profits. And one might wonder if the post-war consensus didn't just have domestic limits to profits, as if any endogenous or exogenous shock, like, I don't know, oil in the 1970s could spiral the whole thing out of control. And maybe it only lasted for a generation anyway. Maybe I'm playing my hand. Another thing that that Lenin took Kautsky to task for in this period was that the peace that Kautsky envisioned was actually built on the backs of the exploited colonies. And Lenin suggested that super profits gained from imperialism allowed the ruling class to bribe the top layer of the workers in Europe, making them lose their revolutionary edge. Now, this is not yet third worldism. We don't have this idea of labor aristocracy being the dominant thing moving everything, and that there's no such thing as a proletariat. And even the imperial countries, and Lenin probably wouldn't agree with that either. But he did think that the profitability allowed the buy-off of the leaders of the labor movement. I don't think there's any way around that. A multipolar world looks a lot more like what Lenin is describing, but a bipolar world really did kind of look like the world that Kautsky was. Now, we could get into some of the other issues here. Dependency theory and world systems theory both come into play. But there is a very, even if we agree with Kautsky's description of capitalist competition limiting itself to maintain its exploitation of the colonies, the idea that it was something that socialists could just take over through democratic fiat seems to have been thoroughly disproven. So there are some differences, though, even between Kautsky and Hilferding that we need to look at. Hilferding's finance capital assumed that a general cartel would be a nation-based scenario, and said very little about the war implications involved, but didn't take nearly the view of Kautsky of like a managed global capitalism. Kautsky saw war as an error that was probable but could be avoided, and that capitalist bourgeois rationality would avoid it. Now, I might think one of the problems socialists have is often assuming rationality where there shouldn't be any assumed, but nonetheless, that was his thought. Hilferding actually somewhat agreed with Lenin that war is a tool of the state to protect finance capital. Hilferding thought that we'd be getting into more and more totalitarian state capitalism that was highly organized and could be seized for socialism, but he did not seem to project this out on the international level in the way that this idea of a managed, stable global economy would predict for Kautsky. Now, I could mention Rosa Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital, which is actually written about the same time as Bukharin's Imperialism in the World Economy. But Luxemburg essentially agrees with Lenin, although with different economic justifications. We can kind of see here, though, that we are pulling from the same base assumptions that we started off with Hobson and Hilferding in the beginning of the 20th century into the 19th. And this is the basis of a few things. So I'm just going to remind you that super-imperialism or ultra-imperialism kind of goes away as a theory. It is somewhat resurrected by Michael Hudson, but Michael Hudson's theory of super-imperialism is basically an early form of modern monetary theory and had very little relationship at all to Kautsky's theories on the question. In fact, I think when Hudson has said that it was more just an accident of a name and invoking Kautsky's text that led him to name that book that, but I would need to look it up again. When we get into later theories of imperialism, Hudson's form of super-imperialism is something we're going to have to talk about, but it's a little bit beyond of the scope of today. All right. I think we're going to end here because these episodes tend to be a little long. But this is a crucial hinge point. There are two texts written in the next year, 1915, 1916, that are going to lead to Lenin's total game change in 1917 in terms of theories of imperialism and Marxism. But as with many cases, there is a continuity and a disruption between Kautsky and Lenin. There is continuity in what they are describing led to the conditions of World War I, but there is a profound disruption on both the meaning and stability of any attempt to get out of that. And that is something you should think about. But it also implies a couple of different notions about how to deal with the problem. Could cartelization between states offset war? And even Lenin admits maybe, but unlikely. Does that lead to the creation of something that socialists can just democratically take over? I think that's the thing that seems the most transparently, obviously disproven here. Nonetheless, I do think this is a super important text that is frankly underread. And gives us some insight to what was later going to happen with things like NATO and CETO and the IMF and the WTO and even the UN and what Wilson was on about with the League of Nations. That needs to be handled because a lot of imperialism theory, which just rotely recites Lenin as if it's automatically true because Lenin said it, just like us reciting Marx as if it's automatically true because Marx said it, becomes somewhat of a problem. After all, even a lot of Leninists actually think the mechanism of imperialism is quite different than what Lenin laid out. I would like to thank my patrons, and I have a few Kahanins and other high-level patrons to announce. I would like to announce that Patrick O and author W, thank you for your support. I really do appreciate it. And I'd also like to announce that we now will take year-long subscriptions at a discount if you want it over there at the Patreon. If you don't have the money for the Patreon, I do have Discord. The Discord is free if you ask, and you automatically can ask for it if you're in the Patreon, but it's not a patrons only Discord because I have rules. And I feel like those rules are beyond just pay for play. And there's a free podcast for the interview shows, which also come out on Tuesdays. And these solo shows will come out every Monday and Fridays when I want them to, but probably 2 or 3 times a month. And that's what we're doing now. I will go back and forth between doing immediate topics and these kinds of explainers. And I'm going to go through the history of imperialism. Well, the history of the term imperialism and how it's applied. I'm not going into the actual history of imperialism. Go read Hobson for that and other people. Hobson is actually the Age of Empire is actually quite good. But we're going to go over the theoretical underpinnings of the theories of imperialism and why the term doesn't really have a precise definition, and maybe its family resemblances aren't even clear either. It's definitely not before Hobson changed the definition. And it makes it hard to talk about in Marx because when Marx talks about what we call imperialism, like I said, it seems like he's talking about primitive accumulation, or banking capital. But again, it takes a lot to go through and see how this all applies today. We just need to start being more precise in our terminology. Protect your peace.